You're supposed to think like Messiah Jesus. Everybody knew that Messiah Jesus came into existence in the womb of his mother. So look at the figure, Messiah Jesus. Although he was in the image of God, that word form there, he was in the image of God perfectly. The first Adam was also in the image of God, but he failed dismally. Jesus was the true image, if you like, the stamp of God, the character of God. But he did not regard that extraordinary condition that he enjoyed as something to be taken advantage of. Jesus was, in fact, the very image and character and splitting image of his Father. That's a huge elevation, but he didn't use that supremely high position for his own benefit. But he emptied himself like a servant. He washed the dishes rather than asking everybody else to serve him. How did he do that? By taking the form, that's the same word, the role. So let's say he was in the role of God. He was playing correctly the role of God, but he lived out conscientiously the role of a servant. And after being born, we know when that was, just like any human being, and being found in human form, he was indeed found to be a man. He was a man who was tempted in all points as we are, and yet without sin. So having been born, that's obviously when he was born, during his life, his career, he humbled himself. That's the same thing then as not regarding his equality as something to be exploited. He humbled himself, he washed the dishes, and his whole life was a model of obedience. I don't find this very difficult. What's difficult about this? He became obedient even to the point of giving his life. That's complete obedience, although he was in the role of God. He could have said, I am God's son. I'll call the angels. They'll rescue me from all of this sort of thing. He didn't, because he knew that God's will was for him to die in a substitutionary manner for our sins, to die on our behalf. And because of all that, God therefore exalted him very highly by resurrecting him and taking him to the right hand of the Father. So it's not very difficult. The participles go along quite naturally there. Any modern translation would be helpful.
I think you mentioned the suffering servant parallels, maybe. So this is typically understood also to be in Paul's mind as he's writing about this. He has the suffering servant of Isaiah in mind, and you can see why. So verse 7, Jesus was in the form of a servant, and that's the servant of Isaiah 52. My servant, his form was marred beyond human likeness. Verse 8, he humbled himself, Jesus, the suffering servant, Isaiah 53, in his humiliation, justice was denied him. And then Jesus poured or emptied himself, became obedient unto death, as Anthony noted. And then again, Isaiah 53:12, he, the servant of Yahweh, poured out his soul unto death. You have verse 9, God has highly exalted him, actually super exalted him, as the Greek says. And in Isaiah's case, the servant, he will be exalted, lifted up, and will be very high. That this great description of the suffering servant in Philippians 2, every knee will bow, tongue confess that Christ is Lord, that is the Lord Messiah. And that's obviously a God thing, right? So the honor that was given to Yahweh, God the Father, according to Isaiah 45, will be equally given to his son, his servant. So that, and then this is the important climax, let's call it, of this section, so that every tongue should confess that Jesus Messiah is Lord, to the glory of the one God who is the Father. And that's Anthony's paraphrase there. Anthony, your paraphrase.
Yeah, well, there you go. All of that, then, is not to make a second God, heaven forbid. All of the glorious things that Jesus did, his obedience and so on, and that parallel with Isaiah is exactly right. I'm so glad you have that as a PowerPoint. It can produce that, because it's strikingly obvious that Paul has in mind that passage in Isaiah 53, of course.